Hi and welcome back to my channel. I'm Vanessa, hypnopsychotherapist, and on this channel we talk about all the psychological side of binge eating and overeating and weight loss. So in today's video I thought I'd discuss the biggest difference between binge eating and food addiction. What are they? So keep watching to find out. So could you be, do you think, suffering from one like binge eating, or do you think you could be suffering from food addiction and you're like, do I fit into a category? It can be really, uncertain. So let's talk about what binge eating is, what food addiction looks like, and then some of the differences, some things that do cross over, and it can help you decide which perhaps pattern that you fall into. So binge eating disorder is a classified, eating disorder, and that's in what's known as the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. So binge eating disorders, what are the characteristics? So firstly, it's recurrent and persistent episodes of binge eating. So binge eating is classified as having, eating much more rapidly than normal. Eating, way past being uncomfortably full, eating large amounts of food when you're just not hungry. Hunger doesn't even come into it. Okay, eating alone, so this might be secretly at night or just alone when nobody else is watching, because you don't want to face the embarrassment or the judgment of eating. There's also, a marked level of distress while eating. So this is, sort of very, very stressed out, and eating sort of helps you manage that. There's also distress after you've eaten. So it's, feeling guilt or shame over the amount that you've eaten. But what is absent is any sorts of compensatory behaviours like purging or excessive exercise. So you get that binge eating then is, totally binging out large amounts of food, short space of time, no hunger involved. So it's very quick, rapid eating. So food addiction is not classified as an eating disorder. But it's not to say that you can't have addiction to food, because I see it quite a few times with my clients where, they feel addicted to sweet things are a classic, like sugar, chocolate, but also sometimes people are addicted to savoury things like crisps. That's a biggie. So some of the symptoms of, let's say, an addiction, so a substance use, disorder, I fall into four categories. So you've got impaired control, where you just, can't, you have a strong urge to use something and you just can't control yourself. So, you wouldn't be able to stop yourself going into the cupboard and helping yourself to those crisps or chocolate. It's just like constantly there. You might have social problems, for instance, where the behaviour of constantly going to want to use this substance interferes with your social life or your social relationships. You've got risky use. So this is putting yourself in dangerous situations where it's perhaps dangerous, but you still continue on with eating the food. So for instance, with a substance use disorder, this might turn into something as bad as knife crime, but you're not going to get into that with over, chocolate bars. I hope not. But it is going to be, for instance, your health is really bad. You might have, a disease like diabetes or something, but you still can't stop eating the chocolate and the sweet. So that would be the risky use category. And then you've got tolerance, where after a certain period of time, you find yourself needing more and more of the food to experience that same level of high. So what are some of the differences between binge eating disorder and food addiction? So binge eating disorder is associated with that, large amounts of food in a very short space of time, where food addiction could be just a constant drip feed of your particular food. So binging often happens in that short period of time, but with food addiction, there is no time limit. It just, keeps going. So once you've had a binge, that's it. Normally you're done, you're dusted. You won't touch that food for probably a long period of time. Whereas with food addiction, as I say, there is no time, stop and start. It's just when you fancy it, really. Binge eating is often not associated with hunger. So it's usually a trigger, like an emotion, that causes a binge. Where food addiction, it may be triggered by hunger or just also a fancy. So there's not a strict rule on that. So with binge eating, it usually comes a binge to suppress an emotion. So you feel an emotion. This is obviously going on unconsciously because you don't sit there and go, oh, I'm feeling this, I'm going to have a binge. But you do perhaps feel a binge coming on, but you just perhaps don't know why. Where with food addiction, there's not so much this urge of, oh, I've got to like suppress an emotion. It's often the food gives you great amount of pleasure, and that's why you go back to that food time and time again. I think a lot of binge eating takes place in secret, and that's because we've discussed, the embarrassment or the fear of judgment. Who wants to be judged because you are eating perhaps a large quantity of time, and nobody wants to have other people's comments, if you're going to eat a large amount of food. Whereas with food addiction, because you're perhaps drip feeding yourself with that food, little and often, like a packet of crisps here, another packet of crisps, another packet of crisps, nobody's really going to comment on you eating, let's say, one bag of crisps or one chocolate bar, because it's all very acceptable that everybody else will perhaps have a chocolate bar. So there's sort of that less comments there. In food addiction, the typical features of addiction are, that tolerance, but also the feelings of withdrawal. So, if you don't have that food for a little short period of time, it's like, oh, I really want it again. Whereas with binge eating, you don't get that tolerance levels, or you don't get withdrawal symptoms. You have your food and then you're like, oh, that's it, I'm done. So food addiction is more about an addiction to a substance. So in this case, it's food. And it could also be a certain type of food, like, your chocolate or like your crisps. Whereas binge eating is more about the pattern of eating. You might have your favourite foods to binge on, but that might change depending on what's there. It's the pattern of when you binge and how often you binge and how much you binge on, and then what you do after a binge is a big difference between food addiction and binge eating. So what are some of the similarities between binge eating and food addiction? Control. It can feel like you have totally lost control over the eating of the food. I think the behaviour still, persists despite all the negative effects, like, weight, you're putting on weight, or, your ill health. There's a feeling of not being able to correct or change your behaviour. So it's similar to not being able to control, but you might try to change the behaviour, you might try to change your patterns, and you can't. You might be able to try and stop eating that particular food, and you just can't. Both of them, though, will get worse over time if you don't go and seek help for it. Also, both behaviours will have some sort of associated trauma underlying it, or it might be very, very mild trauma, but there'll be something underneath causing both behaviours. And I think getting help is definitely one way that will help you massively to help you with these behaviours. So if you really liked what you see on my channel, please subscribe, and look forward to seeing you next week.